Hello, hello, good morning everyone. Buenos dias, bom dia. My name is Pedro Rothstein and I'm a project manager, researcher at People's Palace Projects. And I would like to welcome you today to this webinar on challenges in Indigenous research. It's the second week of our international webinar on Indigenous research methods. And I'm very excited to be the translation here. Sorry. Apologies for that. I can hear the translators speaking after me. One of the amazing perks of Zoom Live. So we're live streaming this event, as I was saying, as part of the International Webinar on Indigenous Research Methods, organized by People's Palace Projects at Queen Mary University of London with the support of AHRC and UKRI. So I'm sorry, I'm still hearing the translations. My apologies again. So I just want to say thank you to the authors and the people who have supported this publication that we are launching today. So the purpose of this webinar is to, should I take the...
No, that's it.
Okay.
So you don't get disturbed.
So the purpose of this webinar is to present, to launch this new publication on Indigenous research methods, which is a collection or a compilation of different articles, think pieces, interviews, letters, exchanging between Indigenous researchers, non-Indigenous researchers, and thinking about the past, present, and future challenges in terms of Indigenous research methods. So we wanted to invite some of the authors to be here with us today to talk about their articles, to present the publication, and to engage in discussion in a debate afterwards. The session will last until 11 o'clock UK time, and I hope you do enjoy. We have live streaming, as you said. I had it on my headphones in Spanish and Portuguese. So I would like to just pass to Professor Paul Heritage, who is Artistic Director of People's Palace Projects. Paul, good morning.
Thanks, Pedro, and thanks to everyone for joining us, particularly the speakers who are going to follow, and the writers, of course, as Pedro said, of this incredible new publication. It's available free online to download from the People's Palace Project's website. If you've got any doubts, just get in touch with us. We can send you a physical copy as well if you want one. This is a journey that some of us started over 3 years ago, and Ian Stanton from AHRC is going to talk about that later. But as Pedro said, the idea of the research councils was to set up a space in which we could think about if there is such a thing as Indigenous research methods. Does it make sense as a debating subject? I think over these 3 years, we've really proved it has. We were a very small group of people that AHRC and ESRC brought together at the beginning, but it was a very interesting because it was clearly people from very different disciplines, from anthropology, from architecture, from drama in my case, from people working on Indigenous languages, from people from the museum sector as well as the HEIs, and just a chance for us to think about, well, if UKRI is going to set up a set of guidelines, or are there going to be funding calls? We were really given this brilliant brief just to be as open as possible, discuss as much as possible. a potential direction for this work within UK research. So the idea was gathered steam to actually set up a workshop in Rio de Janeiro, which we had great pleasure of hosting with the Kwikuru people from Brazil, with Takuman Kwikuru as the co-curator with myself, and we brought together, with the funding from obviously from UKRI, we brought together 11 researchers from the UK with their Indigenous partners. And part of the preparations of that was the first series of these essays that we've been producing along these 3 years. And they're also still available on the UKRA websites and also from People's Palace Project's websites. So there's quite a bit of publications and thinkings we've had, but lots of debates, lots of talking, lots of ideas have been exchanged. And I hope this series of 6 events that we're running this year, which I think is sort of the end of an arc, end of a cycle that we've been on together, a journey, let's hope that we can produce some more thinking through these 6 seminars. Today is just really to launch the publication. We started last Monday, with a seminar on the fight for climate justice, a webinar, a very powerful conversation with 4 Indigenous women from Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, and Venezuela. And what's been brilliant about Zoom, even though these in webinars, of course, the attendance can be quite small, it's interesting to note that in the weeks since the webinar has been up and available on our YouTube channels, it's been visited, it's been watched by over 250 people. And I'm really pleased that we've had the opportunity to take these debates out to wider audiences. In Rio, we brought together 40 people for the workshop at the Museum of Indigenous People in Rio de Janeiro. But we also did an event at the planetarium for over 300 people. The 2 webinars we ran last year were attended by 60 people, but we also did a major event with a British theatre maker, Simon McBurney, and Takuman Kwikuru, the curator of this series, which had over 1,000 people at the webinar. And we're really hoping that continues in these 6 events that we're staging. Last weekend, for example, we staged an event together with the ICA as part of this series that brought together Indigenous filmmakers showing 12 films at the ICA, and we had over 350 people at that over that weekend. So part of what we're trying to do, and I think the focus of this has not just been an internal discussion within the HE sector, it's been very much an open discussion, not only with academics, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, but with artists, with makers, with museum sector, and we hope in some way with the general public. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Professor Andrew Livingston, who's the Vice Principal of Research and Innovation at QMUL, and who's written a foreword for our book. So, Andrew, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, and welcome to everyone from what is today sunny London. I'd just like to start by congratulating you all on bringing this book to fruition. So I was privileged to be able to write a foreword for it, but I know that when you work on a project like this, and it takes 3 years, finally bring it to fruition is always a really satisfying moment. So I'd just say congratulations to all the contributors and to all the people who've contributed to the book. I think it's a fantastic effort. Well done. Just a little bit about Queen Mary University of London. We were founded over 200 years ago in the East End of London, which of course is one of the global melting pots of cultures and ethnicities and people. But actually our origins go back to 1123 when we started out as the first teaching hospital in the UK. And I think, you know, Queen Mary has always been connected with teaching, and particularly with working with people who need help and serving people in the East End of London. And our mission is to open the doors of opportunity to those from underrepresented communities. And that ethos, which has been with us for more than 800 years now, continues to inspire us today and remains at the heart of our university. So if you think about all the universities in the world as a forest, I would say that Queen Mary is a tree with very deep roots. And our aspiration is to be the most inclusive, research-intensive university anywhere in the world. And our belief is that, why would we do this? It's because we believe that diversity itself is a potent catalyst for groundbreaking ideas which inform our commitment to bringing new voices and perspectives into research. Through global and public engagement, knowledge exchange, knowledge creation, and meaningful and importantly, equitable partnerships. So the ongoing collaboration between the People's Palace projects, which is here at Queen Mary, and the Kuikiro Indigenous Association from the Xingu region represents, I think, this ethos of Queen Mary at its very best. So this project has created new partnerships. There's a hugely diverse community of scholars, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and these unique collaborations have in turn created new narratives about the importance of the arts in addressing urgent questions of socioeconomic development. Engaged audiences worldwide. So it stimulated some public debate. I know you had a debate at the beginning of this program on climate change, and it sounds like that stimulated certainly some really interesting and passionate discussions. And I think particularly in this last 2 years, which has been an extraordinary time for all of us during the COVID pandemic, I think the way that the People's Partnership projects have worked together with the Indigenous people in Brazil in responding to that crisis has been absolutely fantastic. So I congratulate you all on working together through what for everyone has been a really difficult time, but there's no doubt that it's affected some people more than others. But at the heart of all our research endeavours at Queen Mary is our commitment to acting with the highest ethical standards and with integrity. And I think this can be challenging. I think it can be particularly challenging when you get into Indigenous research and who is indeed Indigenous and who is not Indigenous. And I think for research partnerships that aim to legitimize and make visible these excluded perspectives, it's still very challenging. And so if we're trying to illustrate these issues or address issues of socio-economic injustice, which can come because of systematic inequalities around finance, access, and the circulation of knowledge, I don't doubt that it's difficult to maintain these high standards. But I think from reading through this book and looking at the way that this project's been run, one thing that really stands out to me is what looks to me like the very equal nature of the contributions from the non-Indigenous and Indigenous sides of this debate. And I personally found that really satisfying and something to be really proud of as someone at Queen Mary. So this workshop, I think this started in 2019 with a workshop in Rio, led by Paul and Takuma Kuikiro, offered a great opportunity to explore these challenges and research partnerships and the way that the interaction between Indigenous and non-Indigenous partners and the research that they do together fits. And I think what's particularly interesting to me in looking through the book and reading about Takuma was that it turns out instead of saying he's a filmmaker, he now says he's a researcher. And I think that's really interesting for me and really dynamic in the sense that the Indigenous people are studying also the non-Indigenous people. And I think that's something that I hadn't appreciated until I came into this. And I think that's a really interesting perspective. So I think that's a particular focus on culturally sensitive knowledge exchange makes it a real equitable co-creation and mobilization. So congratulations to all of you. That's really well done. And I think I just finished by saying this is really a shining example of how research projects can inspire large institutions like Queen Mary to do better things. So Queen Mary is learning from this collaboration. And in doing so, we are learning how to be better able to fulfill our own core values and mission. So we're really, I think, indebted in this to Kuikiro people for sharing their knowledge and expertise with us. And I think I would like to express particular gratitude and respect to Takuma Kuikiro, who actually is a fellow of Queen Mary University of London. But I think if I read through all of this, that with Paul, it's Takuma's wisdom, creativity, and vision that have really been the vital ingredient in so much of what this partnership has achieved. So I look forward to hearing more, but I thank you to all of you and congratulations on such a successful piece of research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for your kind words and obviously the continued support from Queen Mary. I think that we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that support and this melting pot environment that allows these engagements and diverse connections to happen and to thrive. I just want to say something now that I managed to work out the translation problems that I had at the beginning. Just a few things about the publication. So I think it does speak about this exchange of knowledge and understandings of what research is. So research is not necessarily just text-based or visual. It can be both. It can engage international partners who come from a different identity or background, and people in the academia. And as Andrew was saying, this is really at the heart of this project. It has been for the past 3 years. So this book is a summary and a conclusion, I would say, for new beginnings in the future, but it is the end of this long process. The illustrations that you will see inside the book, they're beautiful. They're made by a Brazilian artist called Aislan Pancaruru, who is an indigenous artist, but also a doctor. So he also, let's say, plays in different fields of knowledge and practice. And he will be joining us next week in one of our webinars of the series. The book will be available on PDF on our website after this webinar today. And we really hope that these stories, these narratives, these exchanges inspire other institutions in the UK and beyond. And on that note, I really want to call now two of our partners who have endorsed and allowed this to be possible: the webinars, the workshops, and obviously the publication. So we have Professor Christopher Smith from the UKRI, AHRC, and also Dr. Ian Stanton. If you want to talk us a little bit more about why is it important to fund projects like this, and what are the challenges in Indigenous research moving forward.
Thank you very much. Good morning, buenos dias, bon dia. It's a real pleasure to be here to speak to this super new publication, but also a very important project. I'm keen not to take too much time because the most important people here are the authors of this report, but also people on the audience who may be able to engage in the debate. But I just want to pick out a couple of the comments that are made in this report, which I think are really important for UKRI as a funder. Lilly Sar, in her essay, argues that research is not about seeking to know what is out there, rather it is about how and what you're building for yourself and for your community. I think that's a really powerful statement of what research is for. Often we're charged to think about research either as blue sky or discovery research, or as instrumentalized for particular purposes of innovation or economic growth. We see that a lot, particularly at times of budgets, such as we had yesterday in the United Kingdom. But actually, I think thinking about research from the point of view of an Indigenous perspective, as has been done by this project throughout, makes us realize that actually all research has a public function, but that we need to think very hard about what that public function is and understand it from the point of view of the public, not from abstract economic benefit, but real social benefit. In the foreword that I was asked and privileged to be able to write for this, I said that relevance, respect, responsibility and reciprocity are what research is in essence, not byproducts, but the very essence of what we should fund. And I genuinely believe that that is an ethos which at the Arts Humanities Research Council, and also in my role as UKRI International Champion, we need to carry forward through future funding rounds. What's so important, it seems to me, is that the research that we fund should be for public good. That is part of the UKRI strategy, and it has a consequence when one thinks about stability of funding. One of the risks that all of us are very well aware of is funding that comes on stream and then goes off stream. And that's unhelpful for really embedding the kinds of perspective which you've brought to bear in this project in all of our research. So it's really important that yesterday we received a 3-year settlement, the first multi-year settlement for UKRI, and that gives us an opportunity to really think together about how we ensure that the research that we do is based on the kinds of ethical principles which Andrew Livingston outlined in his excellent presentation from Queen Mary. And I really commend the way that Queen Mary have supported this research. And I'll conclude by saying that this isn't because of just an ethical drive, but it is because we genuinely believe at UKRI that bringing Indigenous voices and Indigenous perspectives into the heart of our research makes better science, and that is what we are here to fund. So I'll pass to Ian Stanton now, who will say a little bit more about the history of this project and AHRC's contribution. But I wish everybody well for future research and also for an enjoyable set of events around this launch and this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. So my name's Ian Stanton. I head up the international development team within AHRC. I was looking back through my emails earlier and found the first mention of this was at the tail end of 2017. So actually, we've been working on this for quite a while. We commissioned some case studies, which again you can find on the website, which led us to the first event in Brazil, which Paul's spoken about, and the webinars subsequently. And it's been really exciting to watch it grow over those several years now. And I think what I've been really delighted to see is that, and that we embedded right from the start, was that there is co-design in all of this. There is equal participation from UK-based researchers, but also their overseas partners. And I think that comes through really strongly in the publication. It's certainly influenced how we've done funding as AHRC, but also as UKRI. And I think that's something that we're really keen to push forwards with. As Christopher said, we've just had the spending review. So as we start to plan what next for AHRC, for UKRI, those ideas of equitable partnership, of co-design, are going to be really central to that. We are looking at how we take this program forwards. As Paul said, we're kind of at the end of an arc on this. But we're kind of thinking, well, what are the next steps? And again, I think it's going to be really important to have that co-design to involve people from Indigenous communities in that conversation. So it's not just people like me coming up with ideas. I think also reading through, there are a lot of challenges for the research community that are highlighted in this publication, but there are also a lot of challenges for funders. And I think that's something that we're going to take away and look through and see what we can do about that. There are particular issues around peer review and assessment, and how we involve Indigenous voices in that. Actually, it's worth plugging now that AHRC's peer review college is open for applications at the moment, and actually we'd love to get some of those voices on that college. And that would, as Christopher says, we're looking to fund better research and better science, and having those voices on our peer review college will enable us to do that. So I won't say much more except to say thank you to Paul and his team and everyone who's been involved in this over the last however many years it's been. As I said, it's been really exciting to watch it grow from, I think there was a group of about 5 of us initially, to where we are now. The publication is excellent, and I do commend it to you to have a read through and to take stock of what lessons there are in there. As I said, for the research community, but also for funders. So yes, I will stop there and hand back to Pedro.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Ian and Christopher, for pointing out the challenges and really stressing that funders also have a lot to learn. We are very pleased to have you here today and have had your support throughout those years and beyond, hopefully. So without further ado, I will pass to 2 of the authors who are here today. They are the non-Indigenous authors, but they have been involved working with Indigenous communities for quite some time. And we are hoping to have 2 of the Indigenous authors as well. One of them is from Kenya. He's not here yet. He might join later. and the other one is Lilly, who is not going to be online with us, but she has sent an amazing video that we will play later. So, Gareth Loudon, would you like to come in?
Yes. Hopefully, can you hear me? Yes? Okay, good. Yeah, so thanks for inviting me, and yeah, it's been great to be part of this journey. The article I wrote was talking about the insights gained from the workshop as a whole. So a lot of that data was the recordings, so I went back through the recordings and looked at the insights. So actually a lot of the insights that I'm sort of just going to briefly highlight from Giovanna, who you're going to hear in a minute, and Lilly and Kimaren, and a lot of other people. So I was also part of the project in the sense that I did a project in India with indigenous communities in southern India, linking with a university in India called Amrita. So I was particularly interested in human-centered design, which I'll maybe briefly mention in a short while, and how that then came out. So the title of my reflection piece is The Role of Human-Centered Design in Indigenous Research. You can see a lot more detail there, but I'll just give you a sort of flavour of some of the highlights that came out of sort of reflecting on the workshops predominantly that were held in Brazil back in 2019. And for me, I highlighted 4 key themes that came out. There were more, but there were 4 key themes that particularly struck me. The first one was the key point made by a lot of the Indigenous researchers represented at the workshop around the importance of self-determination. And it was sort of described by Kimaren, in fact, as one of the sort of fundamental issues of indigeneity and this idea of self-identification and self-determination. And others were saying that, you know, they need to be protagonists of their own research. They wanted the support of the universities to do that, but first of all, this idea of self-determination was critical, and there's other research by saying the importance of sort of development as freedom, Amartya Sen being the notable example. So that was the first theme. The second one was around what I've called creating tangible benefits. And so there was a lot of sort of comments that Western, typically researchers go in and they could well work with the indigenous communities, but it's predominantly about raising awareness and advocacy. And the voices coming back from the workshop is that's not enough. There needs to be more than just raising awareness and advocacy. There needs to be action. And also the view that they're still sort of feeling they're perceived as the informer and the object of the research rather than the equal co-participant and co-designer and co-researcher in that work. For example, they were saying often the Western academics then would take that stuff back at the end of their project, publish their work, further their career, and there's no real benefit to the indigenous communities beyond raising awareness. So this was a big issue that was raised during the workshop. The third one was this idea of what I've called holistic thinking and interdisciplinary approaches. So, I don't know, quote you'll see in the article, it says, why is anthropology in the mix and not any other scientific discipline often in these types of research? In fact, Pamela Mason from the ESRC in the workshop highlighted it was important to learn beyond skills from the social sciences and humanities, and include things like engineers, health researchers, natural scientists, environmental scientists, to work in an interdisciplinary manner to really try and have that action and not just that advocacy. So this idea of taking more interdisciplinary approaches and supporting that was a key theme coming out. And then the final one I picked out was called what I've called building capabilities. So again, was that how can we more sustainably support Indigenous research in the local communities? And Kimaren and Lilly and others raised the idea of this idea of supporting, for example, through establishing knowledge centres or research and knowledge hubs in these spaces where the information is not just taken away and used by the Western, but it is captured and shared and academically published through those types of spaces. Again, this sort of links back to this self-determination as well, and they can focus on developing the capabilities that matter to them, that matter to them. Giovanna also, in one of her articles she presented in the workshop, actually talked about sort of key elements that Indigenous research should have and should be driven by, and she might mention this in a minute, the idea that questions are probably raised by the Indigenous communities themselves. There should be this full inclusion of Indigenous people at all stages of the research process. There should be an interdisciplinary element, and that we need to ensure engagement and knowledge mobilization and sustainable impact. And actually, human-centered design, that as an approach, is directly sort of evolved to do exactly those types of things. So in my article, I talk more about the elements of human-centered design, which brings together more social science, engineering, and sort of more business or technical sides, to really do that interdisciplinary work. So you can see more details and examples in the article, and obviously read more about that if you're interested. So in terms of challenges that came up and possible ways forward from that, I think there was a sort of strong advocacy for collaborating more with local partners, close link to the Indigenous communities, not just purely the Indigenous communities themselves, so local universities, NGOs, to really help strengthen that local knowledge centre and research hubs, and to therefore establish these longer term relationships, perhaps looking through scholarships or other means to do that. I mean, obviously, UKRA already has research networking calls, which are really powerful in that, but how can we evolve that, as Ian was sort of touching on a little bit already? So maybe one suggestion that came up from the workshop was a two-stage process of funding calls, where the first stage is more about detailed planning and exploration, and the second stage more about implementation, which again links with the classics of human-centered design approach. It also supports Indigenous groups in terms of their engagement and financial support, and also reduces risk for research councils in terms of managing such calls. Another thing that came up quite strongly was the idea of training and support for academics in the UK and other places, to increase greater understanding of different disciplines and how they can work together, understanding the different skills and roles that are needed, and the different languages used for different disciplines, and maybe to address prejudice that might exist amongst Western academics about different roles and contributions of other disciplines. So that would be relevant both for researchers, but also relevant for reviewers as well, of applications, so that they are a broader understanding of how those different disciplines can work together. And as Ian just touched on there, another thing that came out strongly was the idea of how can the Indigenous communities be involved in the peer review process as well, because that was seen as very important for this co-development and co-creation. So those are the key insights from my work, and happy to tackle more later if there's opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Gareth. I see that we have Kimaren Riamit. Welcome. He'll join us in a moment. But first, I'd like to call Giovanna Fassetta, who's from the School of Education in the University of Glasgow. She herself and Maria Grazia Imperiale wrote a think piece. Grazia was meant to be here as well, but she had an emergency last minute this morning, so she apologizes. But Giovanna, to you.
Thank you very much, Pedro, and thank you, everyone. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. So my name is Giovanna Fassetta, and together with Maria Grazia Imperiale, we wrote two think pieces, one which was brought together in Rio with the other case studies, and then a revised think piece for this publication. Grazia wanted to be with us today, and she makes her apologies, but she had an emergency and couldn't be with us. So the think piece that Grazia and I started off with was published in 2018 and was commissioned by the ESRC, and was an integrative literature review. And we reviewed literature from the past 5 years, from 2013 to 2018, doing keyword searches on several databases. We did not restrict for disciplines, so we had a really wide range of disciplinary perspective of research with Indigenous communities. We were given a framework by the ESRC for the first think piece, which had been drafted on the basis of challenges to effective engagement of Indigenous participants, which had been evidenced by the research. So following the publication of this first think piece, we had the 3-day Rio event in which we were able to really discuss and talk about ways forward, ways to enrich Indigenous research, as Gareth has just touched upon. So for this publication, we decided to integrate the original think piece with new literature that came after 2018, and also with some of the insight and the points for discussion that emerged at the Rio event from our Indigenous and non-Indigenous partners. And the first think piece really had highlighted how the ethos of research with Indigenous communities is always, the stated ethos is to contribute to social justice and to legitimize Indigenous ways of knowing and arguing for Indigenous rights. However, what we found was also that there was a challenge in engaging fully with the Indigenous participants and communities. And something else that we highlighted in the first think piece was that the meaning of participation is really not consistent in the literature. And so there are varying layers and levels of what participation might actually involve and what is articulated, at least in the literature. And the participation sometimes is actually applied to very minimal engagement of Indigenous partners, and to a lesser extent to full engagement of Indigenous partners and at all stages of the research. My apologies. And so this was one problem that one challenge that we highlighted in the original think piece, and which is very much still the case in the more recent literature. The gaps that we highlighted in the first piece were insufficient consideration of the diversity that there exists between and within Indigenous communities. And as I will just say in a minute, this is borne out still of in the literature past 2018. There is also a lack of open and frank reflection, we think, on the challenges, the missteps, or the ineffective practices that have been encountered, so that all research seems to go according to plans, and we don't have chances to actually learn from other people's mistakes. There is also a lack of clarity of how methodologies are adapted to the specific context and to the specificity of the participants, of the Indigenous participants, and there is little information on how research is analysed, interpreted, translated and disseminated in ways that actually engage Indigenous participants and Indigenous communities. Participation seems to very much stop at the data collection stage. There might be some at the start, at the design stage, but after that, it really very much stops. And that's broadly throughout the literature that we reviewed. And this is, as I said, the reviewed think piece highlighted a welcome increase in the number of publications that emphasize the need to engage with Indigenous communities in true partnership and collaborative spirit. There is also an increase in ethical consideration of the implications of Indigenous research, because I failed to mention that also the more recent literature is on the back of the funding of the GCRF funding, which sort of has meant an increase of research with Indigenous communities, and so there is an increase in this awareness. However, there is some of the gaps that we evidenced in the first think piece are still very much apparent, and so we we highlighted the commonalities of what is still an issue within the literature. We also added in the new in the revised think piece particular approaches that we didn't touch so much upon in the first think piece. For example, the two-eyed seeing approach, which is quite common apparently in Canadian health research, and this is a term that came in from Dr. Albert Marshall, who's an elder from the Eskasoni First Nations. And the two-eyed seeing approach is an approach that aims to convey the complementarity of Western and Indigenous sciences that can be brought together to research to make sense of the world. We also brought in specific literature that discusses the COVID effects, the effects of the COVID-19 pandemics on Indigenous communities, for which there is a nascent set of papers and reflections, and the ways in which the COVID-19 pandemic affects and affected Indigenous communities, and the ways in which the Indigenous communities organized to put together culturally relevant care, for example, but also to use digital technologies. And this is another section that we added, the use of digital technologies as a tool for Indigenous communities to organize, to maintain connections, but also to do research. So doing the reading for the two think pieces, and also in the light of what was the debate that was had in Rio, we discussed. Grazia and I discussed several points, and we still have some questions, and we really were trying to give an answer, but then we decided that actually we would put the questions in the revised think piece as a way to try and make the discussion on Indigenous research and research with Indigenous communities a little bit more fine-grained, a little bit more in-depth and reflexive. And the questions are addressed primarily to those of us who are Global North researcher. Because we found that while there is some reflective and reflexive literature out there, and there was definitely a lot of this in Rio, the vast majority of the literature that we reviewed still has some challenges, some questions, still raises some issues, and we group them around three main points. The first one is in relation to methodology and a certain reliance, almost by default, on a very small limited number of research methods when it comes to research with Indigenous communities, and very little considerations of the diversity, as we said at the start, that there is between and within Indigenous communities. And so that was raises issues around homogenization of Indigenous communities that actually were issues that were raised at the Rio event by the Indigenous peoples themselves. The other set of questions is around funding and the important and crucial dimension that funding has when it comes to research, and when it comes also to shaping the balances of power, when one of the partners in what need to be core partnerships and what need to be equal partnerships actually is the one that has the strings to the purse, and so the dynamics that funding creates also within research. And the final point.
Absolutely.
Sorry, and
Giovanna.
The final point. Am I past my time?
Yes, we're very short on time. I'm sorry to cut you.
Okay, I will leave it here then, and just thank you for this opportunity, and I hope that we are able to discuss this perhaps a little bit later if there is time.
Thank you so much, Giovanna and Grazia. We are very keen on time, so Kimaren, if you'd like to join us. Kimaren is joining us from Kenya. He's also one of the authors and an Indigenous researcher himself, leader of the Indigenous Livelihoods Enhancement Partners, ILEPA. Good afternoon, Kimaren.
My name's Kimaren Riamit. I am a member of the Maasai pastoralist community, resident in southern Kenya. I was one of the few individuals who are privileged to reflect on the challenges for the next decade around Indigenous research. I see research and researchers as a powerful systemic influencer that shapes and influences the way society works, including around policies, action, and practice. Research is a powerful instrument around the legitimization process of theory development, of narrative legitimization, and labeling of categories. And I look at this research from a historical perspective, and I apply it on my community, the indigenous Maasai pastoral communities of East Africa, and question the extent to which their current situation is actually an indirect outcome of waves upon waves of research work. And I locate key moments around pre-colonial, a colonial encounter, and the post-independent state. And just as a way of introduction, indigenous communities globally represent 5% of the global population. Yet, when you look at well-being, indicators of well-being, such as poverty, they represent about 15% of those living in abject poverty. And they live in this situation despite the reality that their landscapes represents or overlaps with areas of highest biodiversity concentration globally. And the question is, this sorry state of indigenous people, including my community, to what extent has research indirectly or directly produced this not very favorable situation? And when you read the Constitution, the Kenyan Constitution has actually acknowledged and settled the reality that Maasai pastoral communities, among other pastoralists in Kenya, and hunter-gatherers are indigenous communities who have been excluded from the mainstay or the cake, the national cake, for reasons partly, in my view, attributed to narratives, ideologies, and theories generated by research. At the time of the colonial encounter, before the colonial regime was established in Kenya, from Europe, from Britain, the National Geographical Society sent whom I would call the explorer researcher. These were individuals sent to survey the land, to research the natural resource wealth and the lay of the land, so as to inform and shape the decisions on how colonization and the partition of Africa would be enacted. And one of the first explorer to actually cross Maas Island was one Joseph Thompson. And Joseph Thompson, around 1900, as I've said, was the first European to cross Maas Island. By that time, my community was considered a superpower in East Africa. But the point of departure here is how our community, which is considered generally a people of land and cattle. They keep large herds of cattle and they practice nomadic pastoralism. And it is recorded in a number of research publications that at that time, by the time the explorers were arriving in East Africa, the Maasais were considered the wealthiest ethnic group in Africa in terms of land and livestock ownership. But as we speak, this community has lost 60% of its prime ancestral land. And I could place the point of departure of dispossession and displacement to the field and research report generated by Joseph Thompson. In describing the land, he said, and I quote, "This land is one of the richest lands in East Africa. I have never seen more charming and park-like scene, practically uninhabited and deserted." And the whole idea of, I have paraphrased a quote by Joseph Thompson, but basically those are his words. And this narrative of an occupied, scenic, charming land was meant to entice the European white settlers who are eager to come and find greener pastures in Africa to come over and take over the land for production to feed Europe. And of course, pasture was not seen as a resource. And very soon, these sort of initial statements and research recommendations or observation by Joseph Thompson and other explorers were translated into policy around land. In 1901, 1902, there was an order in council which declared all quote-unquote waste and unoccupied land, crown land, land belonging to the crown, to the Queen of England. And from that point on, the community, my community, has never ceased to lose land, and often because it's projected as idle land. And so I look at this research from how some researchers have dealt with the livestock and land question of the Maasai community. So in addition to this, so the explorer came and presented a picture of a very rich land that is available for grabbing. And laws were made by the colonial regime to facilitate, to legitimize annexation of this land based on the explorer's comments. And very soon, other researchers started coming in to look at this issue of land and natural resources and livestock ownership by the Maasais. And two stands out. One is the work by Ascovis in 1926, who said these communities are suffering from what he called a cattle complex, an irrational attachment to livestock without any economic value, any economic rationale for keeping their livestock. And so they were just crazily attached to livestock, a very serious essentialization of my community's ownership of livestock. And generally, this idea of an irrational attachment to livestock still exists to date, almost a century ago. Another very enduring research work by an economist, a range ecologist, Gareth Harding, is A Tragedy of the Commons, who's also argued that these communities will soon dissipate, will overstock, and therefore overgraze, and therefore the environment will be overstretched, degradation happens, and the system will collapse. And this narrative, yes, creatively establishing mechanisms that will address these challenges that we have highlighted. And these mechanisms or this collaborative work should, for example, entertain the idea of multiple gazes and visions. That is not just one gaze from the nose that matters. There are multiple gazes. And there are also multiple knowers. So the knowers are not just northerners. The knowers are not just Western scientists. Indigenous communities from the ground are also legitimate knowers. And therefore, this rethinking should also allow for an entertainment of layered meanings. It's not just one meaning in research that prevails. There are layered meanings of concepts and processes and ideas beyond just the principal researcher from the north. We also need to think about mechanism to neutralize the power imbalance. In thinking about decolonizing the research through facilitating joint decision-making, co-generation of knowledge, co-ownership of this knowledge, and thinking together how this knowledge can inform practice. And therefore, this calls for a very interdisciplinary approach to research, of pulling biophysical and social sciences within a cross-cultural collaboration context to produce a much richer, a much more inclusive vision of these systems that we question. We need to provide room for immediate feedback of research findings. As we saw earlier, indigenous knowledge systems are actually practice-oriented. Knowledge is to save immediate concerns for society. And therefore, while publication in the West is an end in itself, for indigenous people, the immediate concern of knowledge is how it shapes their daily lives and livelihoods. We have seen already some indications of light at the end of the tunnel. The research on indigenous research work by the UK and the Rio seminar that we witnessed was one step towards the right direction in trying to create this partnership that recognizes multiple meanings of situations, multiple visions, multiple gazes that should make the world a richer place in terms of knowledge generation and application. So we should therefore think about partnership that promote reciprocity and respect beyond just mere information sharing and consultation, and ensure reliability in these partnerships to deliver good for society. And thank you very much.
Lilly, coming directly from Papua New Guinea, who has sent us a video as she is in a remote area without connection. So,
greetings from the University of Goroka, Papua New Guinea. The short piece that I wrote focuses on Papua New Guinea's context, particularly looking at the diverse and the rich cultures that we we have. It's really my reflection on the many years I've been working as a community researcher. A point that I want to bring to these discussions is that me as an Indigenous researcher working in rural communities in Papua New Guinea and across the Pacific Islands gives me that responsibility that I am accountable to the people with whom I work. And that in itself brings tension. On the one hand, I'm a researcher in an academic context, yet on the other hand, I look at people's well-being. I look at the context. So it's a balance that I am trying to make between research in academia, that we go in, get data, write research papers, and move on. On the other hand, I want to see what the benefits are to the community. I tell you a short story of a farmer who said, you know, there's so many times researchers have come into the community, but I haven't seen a lot of changes. They come to the community, they tell us stories, and they go away after completing what they've come to do. But they forget that tonight I'm going to be sleeping in a house that is leaking, and tonight I probably am going to go to sleep hungry. So these are the realities of communities in which we work. I mentioned earlier that there are tensions in community with Indigenous researchers. I'd like to see how we as Indigenous researchers can record the experiences of Indigenous researchers in Indigenous communities, which sometimes are very remote communities. So we can all learn the lessons from the stories that we bring on Indigenous researchers, on lessons on how best we can adapt our research methods so that our research methods bring benefit. It's a mutual benefit to us as researchers and the Indigenous peoples with whom we are doing our research.
Very powerful. Thank you, Lily. That's amazing. That's amazing. So, Pedro, do we have Kimaren?
I think the audio is still not working.
Kimaren,
Okay,
we want to hear you,
we're
but I
just
think it
trying
might
to
be
sort out.
difficult.
Yes, I know we're very precious of time. Maybe we can throw
Well,
one little question or reflection. Paul?
I'll just draw some things to the close, and if we can finish with Kimaren, that's a great way to finish. But I'd just like to thank everyone, of course, and to say that the type of debates that we have in this book, and that the type of debates that we've had along this course will continue. This is not, as Christopher and Ian know, it's not about funding alone. It's about the very sort of essence of why we do research and how we do research. And I think what has been so powerful in this whole sequence has been taking us back to some of those roots, as Lily did in her talk. We are going to be, Takuma is actually here. So he's actually here in Queen Mary as we speak, doing his self-isolation, having arrived from Brazil before we go up to COP26. The next actual session in our webinars is this evening. We have a listening session, which is called Healing Sounds, with Shirley Kranaki and Nathaniel Mann, who's a contemporary sound artist. It's an online listening session that will present aspects of healing through the sounds produced by the land, culture and ancestry of the Kranaki people. It's been really important to us, I think, throughout all this process to think about research methods, particularly in reflecting the different aspects of arts and humanities, how we research ourselves and how we involve arts work that will connect with the way in which so many Indigenous researchers themselves are using the different techniques and methods they will be using. On the 2nd of November, we're hosting a webinar called Indigenous Narratives, Reshaping Tomorrow, with speakers from Peru and Brazil. And as ever, it will be available on our PPP YouTube channel. All these events are available afterwards. And then on Friday, November the 5th, we'll do the final session from COP26, when we've got a whole day of films, debates, music, and language workshops with the Kwikuru and the PPP team. And for those of you who weren't there at the beginning, all these... No, he's not managing. Oh, Kimaren. We will, what I was going to suggest, we will make available Lilly's video, certainly on our websites, and we will make sure that we get Kimaren's contribution as well filmed, because Gareth made reference to something we did after Rio, which we made very short clips available from debates, and they have been really successful. We've got something like 10 of those on our website, and it's interesting to hear Gareth talk about going back to those. We hadn't done that before Rio, and we're doing a lot more of it now, just to make some small interventions available in different ways, whether they're to students or to researchers, and the way in which they've been followed through social media and how we can promote them, I think is part of the way, as I said at the beginning, we want to make sure this debate is much as broad as possible and involve as many different publics as possible. So in terms of COP26, we will be there in various events with UKRI, with British Council. We're going to be a part of the New York Times events, but we also have an installation at the Venice Biennale of Architecture, which we're finishing in the middle of November. So there's all of these events we're sharing in different ways as part of our social media. So please do follow us. Please do spread the word about these debates, because as I said, the first one we had about 8 people live and 250 people eventually. So I really hope that we'll be able to continue this, and we'll be thinking about that. I'm so sorry for a sequence that's been so much about debate and about exchange. We haven't had time for questions today, but from the last one we had various questions that came up afterwards, and we will be sharing them with people, and we will make sure that we give us ideas about how we distribute the book as well, Ian. We want ideas from UKRI and as well about what can we, how best we can get the book out there, what's other sorts of events we can do around this. So thank you so much to everyone that's participated today, and particularly to Pedro for moderating. And I'm so sorry, Kimaren, we couldn't be with you live, but we'll make sure that we capture what you were going to say and distribute it. So thank you.